Hello viewers, welcome to this session on Precis Writing. Precis Writing is a very important concept of business communication. In our day-to-day life, we have in some way or the other written summaries and short passages. Like in our school and college days, we have condensed our material into small summaries. Even businessmen, lawyers, journalists, students and teachers, they condense their material. For instance, the businessmen condense their business reports, lawyers, they condense their various journals and documents. Journalists, they have to condense their chapters and passages. Students and teachers have to condense their chapters of textbooks and reference book. So we see that we, in some form or the other, we have been engaging in Precis writing. Now, Precis writing is comprehension and condensation of articles, speech or correspondence. It is summarizing. So what is Precis? It is basically an act of summarizing a passage. Another important thing about Precis is that we present facts and information very briefly. This saves time and brings to us the important content only, and we are safe from reading the whole text. Now, there is a necessity of speedily reading documents. That is why we have to focus on Precis writing. Now, what is a Precis? It is basically a summary or the gist of the main ideas of written matter. Now, how is this done? It is by, now when you are reading a passage, you will have to underline it. So there is a concentration. Then there is a comprehension. You reduce the entire document into brief statements and you condense it. Now, the next thing that we do is the length of summary is not fixed. Generally expected 1/3 of length of passage. So if a document is voluminous, we reduce it only to 1/3. Now, Precis is also not a paraphrase. That is, paraphrase means if the existing text is repeated and by changing the language only. No, it is not a paraphrase. It is more than a paraphrase, as we change the entire language at times and we include the important points and the important facts. The emphasis is to grasp the main ideas of passage in a Precis writing. Now, next is the primary objective of Precis writing. The primary objective of Precis writing is to present facts and information. Save time from reading unnecessary details. Now, you know that we get a document today of 500 pages and we have to present it to the very next day. So it is during this time that we condense the material, produce a Precis and then present it. So we, in this matter, do what is known as zigzag reading and we speedily read the documents. We summarize the main points, and while writing a Precis or while reading a passage, we underline the main points and then we do what is known as an economical way of recording and presenting lengthy documents in compressed form. Now, the secretary's job is to prepare Precis of business documents. You must be knowing that in secretarial practices, one of the training that is given to such aspirants is in terms of Precis of business documents, and that is how to prepare a Precis. Next thing is characteristics of a good Precis. How could a Precis be a good one? So for this, main ideas of a passage has to be deducted and has to be arrived at, and after that organized and expressed in a logical sequence. Now, if we take an example, for instance, if there is a passage on inflation in India, now the present, in terms of the present scenario, we know that inflation is fueled by food and fuel inflation. There is two measures of inflation, what is known as consumer price index and wholesale price index. Now we have various items under wholesale price index and various items under consumer price index. We also discuss that the present times, the passage will also be mentioning that it is due to the global upheavals in terms of war and COVID. But when you are writing Prezi, you cannot emphasize all these points in so detail. You would only be defining the causes of inflation, or you'll be defining what is inflation, which is too much money producing too few goods. So you'll be defining inflation, you'll be stating the reasons of inflation, retail inflation, and then you will be, next thing, you will be discussing the brief factors and you will then conclude. So it is in this way you will be omitting the non-essential detail and examples, and order of flow of ideas should be same as original. It is very important that in a Prezi the flow of ideas is same as original, as there should be a sequence between the various sub parts of a Prezi. It is usually believed that Prezi should not exceed or fall short of the length. That is, the usual length is 1/3 of the length of original. Now, another characteristics of a good Prezi is that the language should be clear. You cannot use jargonized language. You cannot use circumlocutions, that is beating about the bush. You have to be brief and precise, maintaining the style and spirit of the original. Now here we will take another example. For instance, there is a passage on marriage ceremony. Now we know that in a marriage ceremony, the chief protagonists are the bride and the bridegroom. There is lot of exhibition of dress and cuisines. So in that, the cuisine, if the passage mentions in cuisine, there is a starter, there is main course, and there is what is known as the desserts, and the passage might also discuss the various Western and Indian dresses. But when we are focusing on Prezi writing, we would essentially discuss the ceremony briefly without discussing all the details of the food items and all the dresses worn by the visitors or the invitees. So here is just in such a passage on a marriage ceremony, it is essential ideas should be pasted in the original passage. A good Prezi, so far as possible, should be in writer's own words and should not add ideas. It should not be a figmentation or a figment of your own imagination. It should include all the facts which are there in the passage. Now, method of writing a Prezi. How do you write a Prezi? We have discussed what is Prezi and characteristics of Prezi. Now, Sivan, if you are given a passage, how will you write a Prezi? We will first read the passage 2 or 3 times carefully. Then after that, we will prepare the comprehension of passage, which is the first step in Prezi writing. Then after comprehension of passage, we will write down the main points of passage by picking out the essential ideas and leaving out the unimportant details. Like in inflation, where if there is a passage on present scenario of inflation, we would not be discussing all the components of wholesale price index and consumer price index, but we would rather be saying that it is influenced by the two index. At the same time, We will not be discussing in detail if there is a passage of one page, what is the reason of inflation. It is supply bottlenecks, that is cost push inflation or demand pull inflation. So we will be briefly mentioning the upheavals in the economy, and then we'll be preparing a précis. So it will be comprehension or condensation of passage. Another thing in précis writing which is very important is there should be no repetitions, no illustrations, and examples can be eliminated. We cannot repeat the same idea again and again. But in textbooks, when we are writing, we use illustrations, which is a different case. At the same time, in précis writing, we have to use very carefully the sentences, and clauses may also be compressed. Word can be for a phrase and a phrase for a clause. So you can see it is discussed very briefly. Another important method of writing a précis is comprehension of passage requires selection, rejection, and generalization. For example, when we were discussing the passage on a marriage ceremony, we were selecting the protagonist of the marriage ceremony. We were rejecting the whole list of invitees. I will be replacing them by a general term of visitors, and a generalization would be made of the food items, the cuisines, the show, and the invitees. So we have to just in this passage, we just have to write the main points of the passage. Another important part of précis writing is words and sentences of original passage should be avoided. You cannot repeat the same passage over and over again. In many question papers, you would be seeing, especially in business management question papers, you would be seeing that there is a case study, and that also has to be condensed into a small form, which is in question answer session. So when we are writing a précis, we have to focus that in case of any original passage, that there is no repetition of the same words and sentences. Sentences should be linked up for interrelationship of ideas. If there is a sequence or an interrelationship, then sentences can be linked up. Précis should be summary of the original. So it should be a brief or a concise excerpt of the original. Précis should be self-contained, readable, and continuous whole. It should be compact in itself. We do not miss out any point, but we present them in a smaller version following the various sequences of précis writing. Next thing that we discuss is in method of writing a précis is how do we write down the preliminary or a rough draft, keeping in mind the length of précis. First thing is in this is we read the whole précis and we underline it again and again. We may point out the main points, and then we prepare the first draft, and then we prepare the second draft, which is précis. So at the same time, when we are writing a summary or a précis, we write the title to the summary. Short title may be given to express ideas in a passage. This is very important because lengthy titles will disengage attention of the reader. So the title should be short and precise. While making the final draft, one should make sure that main points are included in the final draft. Another thing in method of writing a précis is précis should read well within the length prescribed. When we are writing a précis, we are reducing the material into its 1/3 proportion. So it should be very readable and understandable. Précis should be given suitable heading as we have just discussed. Good précis expresses the ability to think clearly. And we have said that any précis writer will have a clarity of thoughts. Now, we have also to distinguish what is important and what is not. And this is an indication of a précis writer's ability to think clearly. So, it is very important that there should be a clarity of thought and preciseness when we are writing a précis. Now we will discuss what are the problems in writing a précis. First problem is accuracy. How should your précis be accurate so that we can get the facts straight and we do not use lot of jargonized words and circumlocutions. So no statement without support of facts should be given, because we are in a form reproducing a document or a report in a brief summary way. So it should be a precise and support of facts. To go through the précis carefully so that there is accuracy and whatever is stated is factually correct. Another problem in writing a précis is using own words to convey ideas given in original passage is very important in précis writing. For this, you need to read the passage carefully at least 3 to 4 times before beginning the process of condensation, comprehension of a précis. Writing the précis without looking at the original is very important, so that there is a flow of own ideas and words. Using one's word without temptation of borrowing directly from original is also a big challenge in précis writing. Another challenge is using your own words. If word phrases are used from original, the same must be underlined. This will lead to reproduction of important facts only. So own words may be used in place of underlined words. If it is impossible to change some words, then we can replace them by alternative words. One may retain them from the passage. For instance, when we were taking the example of inflation, we cannot change the word inflation. Now, when we were reducing a passage to write a précis, we need to retain some of the core words or the important words. For instance, the passage on marriage ceremony which we are discussing, the word marriage cannot be replaced, so it has to be reproduced. So one may retain them from the passage. Another problem in writing a précis is selecting details. What are the details that has to be included and what are the details that has to be excluded? Problem is deciding on the details to be included in the précis. For example, we have to pick out only those details that are important. As we know that a précis is 1/3 of the entire content of a document, so we need to only repeat the important details. Certain things are more important than others. Only choose those details according to scale of importance. So we have to analyze what is important and what is not important. Another problem in writing a précis is, for example, if we take this example of two people may go to a restaurant and order many dishes. In a précis, converting the above sentence You do not need to mention each item of food. Just mention various types of food were ordered. This was the same example as we were discussing in the previous case, the passage on a marriage ceremony. In a passage on a marriage ceremony or a passage on a visit to a restaurant, we need to avoid the entire cuisine. We can only replace that the food was, or we can only mention that the food was continental, vegetarian, non-vegetarian. So this is way we can avoid repetition of food items. Another important thing is selecting details in is if the person gets drunk, it may be noted that if this is mentioned in a passage, then the observation could be that the person is under the influence of liquor. So the entire conversation may not be reported. So unpleasant circumstances or conversations can be avoided. Another important thing in writing a précis is selecting details. Once the relevant part and important points may be recorded, then after that we have to select certain things that are more important than others, as there is very conciseness of words. So details may be selected according to the scale of importance. Another example that we can study in problems in writing a précis is avoiding conclusion. We cannot jump to conclusion while reading a report or a document, because précis is a factual summary of passage. So one should avoid drawing conclusion based on one's own interpretation of the facts. It should not be a figment of your own imagination. You cannot be judgmental while writing a précis. So personal opinion has no place in a précis, so it is better to stick to details. Another problem in writing a précis is avoiding short sentences. One should concentrate on essentials in the précis. For example, we should not again take the examples which are very exaggerated and are not related to the passage in a remotest way. One should avoid short and choppy sentences. You cannot write a good précis unless you have carefully studied and understood the material you want to summarize. So it is very important that the material should be read over and over again. Avoiding short sentences, for example, if we take an example of a small excerpt which says that Mary is beginning to walk to the church. Now Mary is beginning to walk to the church. She is old and cheerful. She walks with a cane. She has walked this way many times. Here we see that there are 4 sentences, all very short and immediately beginning with the subject followed by a verb. So sentences like these are jerky in style. So we have to avoid such short sentences. Revision of such a passage should reduce number of sentences but keep the same details in the following. So we can see that in the solution to the passage or to the sentence, we can write, Mary begins her familiar walk from her home to the church, and she is an old woman who needs a cane for support, but she is cheerful. So you can see how interesting this solution appears vis-a-vis the important or the previous passage that we discussed earlier. Now we will do one exercise. I will read out a small paragraph for you which has been taken from a passage, and we will discuss how to write a précis by taking the main points and the first draft and the second draft. So the passage reads as this: one of the outstanding features of the century has been the improvement of living conditions of the working men, greater political power, more wealth and leisure, and better facilities for health, security, and education. In earlier civilizations, most communities were sharply divided into two classes: those who labored and those who did not. So, when you are writing a précis of this paragraph, the main point is working classes enjoy better living conditions in the present century. And in the earlier civilization, there was a big gap between the conditions of rulers, etc., and those of the masses. Now, the first draft would include an important feature of this century is the improvement in the living condition of the working classes in the form of more power, wealth, leisure, and security. But your final draft or your précis will be an important feature of this century is the improvement of the lot of workers. In earlier civilizations, kings, priests, etc., lived comfortably, doing little, with the majority worked hard with few comforts and rights. So you can see how a précis has been written by writing the main points. The first draft and the final draft is your précis. Now we can select a proper title which may suggest as the Industrial Revolution and the working class. We can also take into account another exercise, which is a paragraph that before COVID-19, travel and tourism had become one of the most important sectors in the world economy, accounting for 10% of global GDP and more than 320 million jobs worldwide. The global pandemic, the first of its scale in a new era of interconnectedness, has put 100 million jobs at risk, many in micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises that employ a high share of women. So, from this passage, we shall be writing a précis. So, in this, the main points is that before COVID-19, travel accounted for 10% of global GDP. It provided more than 320 million jobs worldwide, and the global pandemic has put 100 million jobs at risk. So the précis would be the COVID-19 pandemic has put 100 million jobs at risk, many in micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises that employ a high share of women who represent 54% of the tourism workforce. Tourism-dependent countries are most negatively impacted because it involves contact-intensive services. So this is the précis, and the title that can be suggested is Effect of COVID-19 on Tourism. Now, when we study anything, there is a moral of the story. So moral of précis writing is, if one is able to write a good précis, it is an indication of his or her ability to think clearly and to distinguish what is important and what is not. Thank you.